those of us who out in, in the different isolated regions, it's funny, consciousness studies is popping up here and there, but it's still in these isolated pockets. So we always have to, look at the lighthouses that have been there for a while, and definitely, the DOPS is there. So I'm gonna turn it over to Molly, who's gonna introduce Kim more directly. But just so wonderful to see everyone's new faces, old faces, and so Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can take it.
Well, I'm super excited to be here, and I have a rather lengthy introduction to Kim because of all of the accolades and scholarly pursuits that she continues to be engaged in. But I also just want to say that I originally stumbled across her work because I found a YouTube of her speaking at a conference, and I was immediately intrigued and inspired and excited about the work that she was doing. I then did a deep dive into all kinds of Kim Penberthy research work. And so since then, I've had the wonderful opportunity to get to meet with her in planning for this talk tonight. And I can assure you that she is as lovely and warm and friendly as she is scholarly and interesting and intriguing. So I do think that we're in for a real treat tonight to hear the work that she's doing at UVA. So just a brief introduction. We have a longer introduction on the bio and the invitation that we sent out, but I will read this now. Dr. Penberthy is the Chester Carlson Professor of Psychiatry at the Neurobehavioral Sciences in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Kim is a board-certified clinical psychologist who conducts research, teaches, and provides clinical care at UVA in psychiatry and the Cancer Center. She obtained her undergraduate and her master's degree in psychology from Wake Forest University and her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University and her fellowship at the University of Virginia. Her research interests focus on the mind-body relationship and exploring human consciousness as well as extraordinary experiences, including the impact of such extraordinary experiences on human abilities and human wellness. Kim is affiliated with the University of Virginia School of Medicine, is a fellow of UVA's Humanism in Medicine. She's involved on the international level of conducting research with the Center of Consciousness Research and the Scientific and Medical Network. She's the president-elect of the Society of Clinical Psychology, the former chair of the American Psychological Association Society of Clinical Psychology Diversity Committee. Oof. She's published extensively, chapters and books, articles, as well as 4 of her own books, including her latest book, which she published with her daughter Morgan, called Living Mindfully Across the Lifespan, an Intergenerational Guide. It's really an honor to introduce her to the program in Creativity and Consciousness here at the University of Michigan. I think Ed and I are almost giddy. We're stumbling over our words in our excitement to bring her to you. So I will let her begin her presentation. And last sentence, if you have questions and want to write them in the chat, please feel free. I will try to keep tabs on that.
Thank you so much. I am very, very honored to be here with all of you and just share a bit of what I've been doing and have a discourse. I really want to make sure we have time for questions. So I know that's always a little more challenging when you're on Zoom, but I think if we can try, I want to make sure we can do that. So, oops, what did I do? Okay, I showed you something and then I took it away. Let me bring it back up here. All right. So I'm going to start at the beginning. We'll go up here. Again, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here at the program in Creativity and Consciousness Studies at the University of Michigan, and want to thank my host, Molly and Ed, for reaching out and bringing me here. It's quite an honor. So tonight I'm going to give a little bit of a presentation and then really spend a lot of time, hopefully, with you with questions and answers and discussion, and really get your needs met. That's my goal today. So because of that, I'm going to give some brief information about my colleagues' work and really focus more on mine a little more in depth. But again, this is going to be sort of a high level. I'm not going to get into a lot of the nitty gritty of the research and as far as statistics and things. So an introduction a little bit to me, and then DOPS and its mission and the research that we do there, which is, as Ed and Molly mentioned, really in the realm of consciousness and looking at manifestations of this idea of consciousness in a sort of a different way. So looking at things like near-death experiences, reincarnation, after-death communications, and altered states of consciousness in general. And I think very importantly, looking at the impact on human experience and abilities and the future of this research. So a little bit about me. I am a clinical psychologist. This is my only job I've done, and I feel so fortunate that I was able to get involved at UVA with DOPS during my career. Early on, I studied contemplative practices and their role in clinical psychology, in clinical work with patients. I still do this work. So my research augments my clinical work, which augments my teaching. So it's all sort of involved and related. Early on, I was a weird little kid reading things like Emanuel Swedenborg and Raymond Moody. And when you grow up reading stuff like that, you end up, interested in doing this kind of work. It was really powerful for me. I learned transcendental meditation when I was young in high school from my mother, and was really supported in that, in looking at extraordinary abilities from these altered states of consciousness. And went on to get additional training in meditation and mindfulness, as well as extensive training in psychotherapy as a clinical psychologist. One little aside, I love to continue learning, and so I'm now enrolled in a course through the Institute of Psychiatric, I'm blanking on the name, it's IPI, and it's looking at learning how to do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I just want to keep expanding my knowledge and looking at ways to help people. And that is a big part of what I do at DOPS. I'm very excited to be part of the history of DOPS. It's been around for over 50 years, established in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson, with really a mission to study these extraordinary experiences that come from altered states of consciousness, and look at the big picture, the big question of what is the relationship between the physical brain and the mind, the conscious mind. So our group is really devoted to doing this research that could be seen as really challenging the mainstream scientific paradigms that we have now, such as physicalism, regarding that nature of brain and mind relationship. So we study phenomena related to this, really specifically looking at manifestations that we can sort of get our hands around. So that's memories of past lives, with a focus that Jim Tucker has on children who remember past lives. Bruce Grayson studying near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences that come along with that. I focus on sort of the other ways of altering consciousness by meditation, mindfulness, and also have recently started collaborating on research looking at after-death communications and what that might mean for us. So again, we look at this possibility that consciousness might be something greater than merely a physically produced phenomena. And really looking at that this idea may be more optimistic, might provide more hope for us as a species and the world, and may be more accurate based on what we're finding than the materialist view. So with that, I'm going to sort of go through quickly some of the research that's done, with the caveat that I'm not the primary researcher on most of this that I'm presenting right now. Jim Tucker is currently the person doing the research on cases of reincarnation type. That's what we call it, CORT for short. This was originally started by Dr. Stevenson. Ian Stevenson is very famous for this. Jim Tucker sort of took over that research when Dr. Stevenson passed away. And these involve very young children. Dr. Stevenson focused on a more global aspect of looking at people around the world, and Dr. Tucker really focuses on US cases. And so, just a little bit about that, it's interesting that really most of these children they're very ordinary sort of kids. There's nothing particularly strange about them on personality assessments or other psychological measures. They may be reporting being a deceased family member or a stranger. They really have memories of both. Often the common theme is that there was some sort of violent or sudden death, which is interesting. There's also things found like birthmark correlations where there's birthmarks. This is what Ed, I think, was talking about, or disfigurements on the live child that are resemblances of how the person died in the previous life. So if they had a gunshot wound that left a scar, the child that was reincarnated is possessing that scar. It's very interesting. Statements usually start at a fairly young age, around 2 to 5, and then stop at between 5 and 8. And they're usually made with intensity. If you've read any of Jim Tucker's books or seen videos, these children are convinced. They're often quite distressed and distraught and wanting to go back to home. So there's cases that have been investigated by Jim. What we see is that it is found in cultures around the world, including the US. Dr. Tucker has written this up in 2 books. Well, now there's a third, which is a combination of the third one is a combination of the first 2. And additional interesting things that you see, that there are often behaviors related to the previous life. So they might have a tendency to, an inclination to the same sort of work or preferences for food. There are emotions about the previous family still held, phobias related to the mode of death, and themes in play that show up that are reflective of what they did or how they died in the past. So all very interesting and compelling research that my wonderful colleague, Dr. Tucker, does. We also conduct research extensively in near-death experiences, and Bruce Grayson is the international leader in this area, who's been with DOPS for decades. A near-death experience is classified as an experience where people report been close to dying or literally pronounced clinically dead and then resuscitated. And we're really conceptualizing this near-death experience, that sort of state of consciousness, as an altered or changed state of consciousness. It's often accompanied by an out-of-body experience where the individual reports feeling separated or separate from their body and being able to observe their body. A lot of this near-death experience research began originally with Raymond Moody, who was at the University of Virginia. As a medical student, he compiled this information and wrote a book called Life After Life. And he continues to do this work and be productive. So he's still around. There are, at this point, hundreds of cases. This number is fairly old at this point, but reporting commonalities that people describe. And as I said, Dr. Grayson is the expert in this area. He recently published a book called After that really where he shares his story about his career, and also shares a lot of case examples, which are very interesting. What we know from the research is that there are commonalities of this overwhelming feeling of peace and well-being, people report being free from pain. They often report floating or drifting through darkness and then becoming aware of a light. And many of you have probably heard of that, that heading towards a light down a tunnel or a hole. Often they encounter a presence. It might be visual even. They may have a life review where they see visual images of their past. And they often report being in another place, sort of where they meet past acquaintances or those who have passed on. And as I said, there's often an accompanying sense of being out of your physical body. What we find interesting about these near-death experiences is that the attitudes change in people after they've had this, as opposed to remembering a past life as a child. So we see people become more spiritual, their compassion for others, their appreciation for life increases, their sense of meaning, and their flexibility in coping also seem to adapt. They become sort of more resilient in many ways. And of course, their belief in a postmortem survival increases. We see attitudes decrease, such as fear of death, or interest in material possessions or personal status or competitiveness. And that's considered generally a good thing. However, obviously in different people's lives, that can also sometimes create some problems. So I found all of this work fascinating and really followed it as a younger person, even before I came to DOPS. And what always struck me was, what about the people that don't remember a past life or haven't had a near-death experience? Are there ways that we can achieve these sort of states of consciousness and maybe these extraordinary abilities or these beneficial effects of feeling more compassion? And so my research that I brought to DOPS was really looking at that with my background in mindfulness and meditation and contemplative practices. I wanted to see, what are these abilities, are often called siddhis. These are extraordinary abilities that in most of the original native cultures of meditation, and I'm sure there's many of you in the audience who are far more knowledgeable about this than me, the goal was this sort of ascendance to this higher level of contentment and peace and harmony and compassion. So I brought with me this desire to study these experiences and looking at how can we develop these experiences and abilities and gifts in people on purpose. And we do know along the line of psychic abilities, or psi, that we often see a significant relationship between meditation, and specifically the amount of meditation, and the ability to do certain things, to have this precognition or this feeling of interconnectedness or transcendence, or even leave one's body, have an out-of-body experience. So these can be produced with different contemplative practices. And I'm well aware that there's also breathing and breath work, body work. We have not moved in that direction yet. That is on my radar, though, that there are many other ways that we can ascend and reach these altered states of consciousness. I was particularly interested as a clinician in looking at this initially to help facilitate wellness. And so we see in the siddhis, many of these are listed here, are things like what can be achieved by altering our consciousness in this way: destruction of what are called defiling impulses. This is often thought of as like overeating, overindulging, excess, addiction. Think of addiction. Also increasing compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others, and social connectedness. And I saw a lack of these things in my patients who suffered from addiction, from depression, chronic depression, and in addition, other areas where we can see maybe some increase in extraordinary abilities. So take a person who doesn't have depression or addiction problems, and how can we help them be their best self, to be more present, have increased intuition. And so really looking at all of this, because with all of the meditation study that have been done, most of them are looking at the impact on wellness, to be honest. They're looking at, does this reduce your blood pressure or increase your mood, elevate your mood? And they often don't ask these other questions. And I began asking those questions, not just in research studies, but with my own patients. And really, some of those initial experiences that I had with my patients spurred me to do more research. So we began looking at the research literature in my lab, and began collaborating with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, who did this wonderful study where they asked people who had been meditating about these mystical experiences, about not just, did you feel less depressed? Did you feel less anxious? But really looking at what other experiences are you having that we're not typically asking about. And as you see here, a large percentage of folks endorsed having these transcendent or mystical experiences and improved mood as well. Overall, almost 70% of them endorse at least one of these, which is a big deal, just from doing meditation, so to speak. Now, you can say this was a group of people out in California who were all meditating, so maybe that was sort of a fluke. However, the research shows, follow-up research, asked people in the general population, scientists and enthusiasts, about these experiences, whether or not they had been meditating. And what you find is that even the scientists, engineers and scientists, were endorsing having at least one of these experiences here, knowing things, in touch with someone far away, something, feeling like you knew something about the future, or being in touch with a deceased, or remote viewing, or an out-of-body experience. This was shocking to me. It's not now, but it was initially. So all these people endorsing these experiences, why are we not talking about it more? Is it just a fluke that if you ask people, then they report this? Maybe these were self-selected. They're the ones who decided to answer the questionnaire. So what I did is I looked at, we got funding for a study and looked at and really determining, comparing them, I guess, meditators versus non-meditators. Now, this was a convenience study. So we looked at people who had never meditated and signed up for a meditation course, specifically of Vipassana. And then we looked at people who had never meditated and were not doing a course. And what we found was really, meditators are a little bit different at the beginning. They seem to have higher rates of some paranormal experiences or extraordinary experiences from the beginning. They believed more in Psi from the beginning. And it got that way even more afterwards. So we found that, okay, maybe there is something to this. These abilities are there. And they are very important and meaningful to the people who were meditating, more so than the comparison group. We tested some Psi abilities online through some online tests that were developed and didn't see any difference there. Here again, the question is there something different about people who were already signed up for a meditation? So this led to the study we're doing currently, and I don't have the results from it yet, where we take naive people who've not meditated and we randomize them. And then we have more control then. We'll have more knowledge about what can happen with these meditative people when they're randomized. So that means we'll take naive people, teach them meditation, again, very rigorously, or we're comparing it to an exercise group where we run them through some exercises and compare them after that. So our hypothesis is based again on the neuroimaging work that we do as well at DOPS, is that what's happening when you meditate is you are altering your consciousness, your state of consciousness, in a way that may be very similar to a near-death experience, in that what seems to happen is not an increase in activity in your brain, but really a reduction, a quieting, almost like you are getting the brain out of the way, the physical brain out of the way, so that something else can be accessed more directly. This goes along with some theories we can talk about later, but it's an interesting fact that this is sort of what we continue to see. I'll touch briefly on my work also with after-death communications. Again, this stemmed from clinical work I was doing. I'll give you one example. I've had many. I work a lot in the cancer center in palliative care with people who are dying, and work a lot with families who are then dealing with that, and also with psychiatric patients. And a lot of the work that I would do with my patients would be teaching them meditation, different kinds of contemplative practices. And I would open up to the opportunity for people to share. One case in particular I'll share with you was a woman in her 60s who was seen in the cancer center. She herself had cancer, but she was not dying from it. She had depression and anxiety, and of course, stress related to her cancer and cancer treatments. She also had just lost her mother, and about a year before I started seeing her. She had a very complicated relationship with her mother, and they were not on good terms when her mother passed away. She had grief that was diagnosed as complicated bereavement. She was really struggling, and I was working with her and decided to work with her on some meditation and help her achieve this sort of altered state with me there in the room. And I'll never forget, she reported one day when she came in that she had been meditating at home, and tears were streaming down her face, and she was really trying to focus on her meditation and felt the touch of her mother on her cheek, and had this strong sense that her mother was present. And this was a loving stroke of her cheek. And she felt the sense that her mother was okay. Her mother was okay with her, and that she could move on. And even when she shared this with me in our session, she began to weep, and just out of relief more than anything. So this was a clear after-death communication that involved the physical touch and the sense that someone was with her, that was very powerful. Her grief resolved fairly quickly, and then we allowed us to sort of work on other issues that she had. She's still alive, she's doing quite well, and is not experiencing this complicated grief anymore. So these after-death communications are when someone appears to be contacted directly and spontaneously by someone else who's passed on. They're not brought about by working with a medium or that sort of thing. So this is what we were looking at in this research. I was part of a large international survey study where really the call went out, and there was across many countries for people to report on this, because there's not a lot out there in the information that's really helpful for us to see how often is this happening, how many people are experiencing this, and what is the impact. And what we found is that obviously people responded who had an after-death communication. So we don't know the rate of how many people are having these. We just know that over 1,000 people responded. I think it was way more than that. I'd have to look. They experienced this as authentic. It decreased their fear of death. increased their religiousness and spirituality, brought comfort and healing, and increased their belief in life after death. And many of them report that this is a really treasured experience. What's interesting, if you start looking in the literature, it's estimated that about anywhere from 25 to 60% of mourners report experiencing spontaneous after-death communications. And that's across, all cultures. They appear, if you look at the data, really to be common natural experiences that most people find comforting and encouraging and sometimes even life-saving. They occur in people of all nationalities, ethnicities, religious affiliations, income, education level. And there's even been research looking at, the mental health status of these folks, and they don't suffer from mental illness generally. Widows and widowers are especially likely to report these events, and women more than men even. And we can talk about the varieties. There's many ways that you can have an after-death communication. But the point is that most of these are happening, and if you ask people about them, you'll find out and see that they really are important to their lives and life-changing. And only about 12% of people endorsed them being frightening. This is comparable to other research that has been what little research there has been. So this was also a way, which was interesting to me, to reduce the fear of death, which is something I'm really interested in, how we as a culture and society can approach death in a healthier way. And that doesn't always mean increase in religiosity, but maybe increasing spirituality, which is what we found happened. We did a survey to sort of look at the fear of death and dying in our population. And it was interesting that it was almost exactly comparable to what other research has reported. About 30% have a good deal, very much, or tremendous amount of fear of death and dying. So it's a big deal, and it can be problematic when it's not addressed appropriately. Interestingly, we did a follow-up study looking at, would people even be accepting of help? Do they want help? Do they know there's help? 62% of them thought that something could help. And when we asked them about these different options, it's very interesting. The psychotherapy was listed as number one. Most of the people thought that would help. Medications, psychedelics, and out-of-body experiences, you see, they're all fairly high. The only one that was really a low in endorsement was this virtual out-of-body experience, sort of like a virtual reality version. They didn't really endorse that would be helpful, they thought. So this was just sort of gearing up for some studies that we have in mind, looking at, pursuing this further. With the impact of COVID, it has become clear to me that this is even more important than ever. Why? Because it has created a mortality shock throughout the world. And it might yield a whole second wave of a population health concern tied to bereavement. No one's talking about that yet. But there are estimates that for every person that died, you have 9 times as many bereaving the loss of that individual. So this is another crisis waiting to happen, this fear of death and dying and bereavement. And I think that the work we do at DOPS can be incredibly helpful in this arena and in many other ones, connecting people, promoting compassion for other people, for ourselves, for the earth. I think this work is so important, and the future directions are so many and varied. I would love to talk to people about your questions you have, and also get ideas from people. What foundations can we use to explain what we're finding? How can we use this knowledge for good? It's what I call the so what question. We can document and document and document, and then we have to say, why does this matter? How does it help us? What would it look like if we could all expand our consciousness in this way? What if we did not fear death? What if we understood we're all connected? What would the ramifications be? So that's where I would love to go. It's lofty and huge, and yet so important that I can't think of anything I'd rather spend the next several decades of my life doing. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope we have time for questions, lots of them, and discussion. And I am going to stop sharing now and invite you, yes, to speak up, shout out.
I'm so excited. This is thrilling. And you stole my question, which is how do we use all of this information to create a brighter, more exciting, more infinite future for all of us? I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat bar or raise your hand and I'll unmute you, because I think it's more fun when everybody gets to talk than just Ed and Kim and Molly. So have at it, folks.
Would you like me to read aloud the questions that are in the chat? Would that work?
Yeah, that would be great, May.
Okay, so Sandy Weiner, I think it's Weiner, asks, any suggestions about approaching very close friends whose eyes glaze over with all of this?
You know, I think enthusiasm goes a long way. In spite of glazed eyes, you know, keeping up that excitement. And I have found really the idea of what are the implications of this can intrigue people and get people on board. Just those sort of questions at the end there that I asked, well, what would it be like if we could all reach this sort of altered state of consciousness on purpose, intentionally? What would that mean if the paradigm shifted and we understood that consciousness was not just tied to our bodies, but went beyond the death of our bodies? You know, just sort of like a thought experiment, you know. And often people will, you know, they'll have to dialogue with you because you're not letting them shut you down and saying, you know, I don't want to talk about it, that's ridiculous. Well, what if it wasn't ridiculous? So that might be a start.
Ali Hussein asks or says, thank you so very much for this incredible presentation. I'm really interested in how you think technology, AR/VR, expands this vision.
Yes. Well, you know, I was exposed to this when a colleague came and had developed virtual reality, augmented reality to help people meditate. And now this is more and more, you know, happening where you can change the environment in virtual reality as you meditate, as you're sort of changing your brain waves and that sort of thing. So I know it can be used in that way to sort of as a sort of a biofeedback tool. We're hoping to get some research looking at using virtual reality or augmented reality to create out-of-body experiences, because there is some idea that, you know, the out-of-body experience seems to be a crucial piece to the near-death experience. We don't know what it is about that out-of-body experience. Is it, we can hypothesize maybe that sense that I am more than just my physical body. Could we create that for someone on purpose and sort of have the same positive impact? It would be a really interesting question.
Nice. Heather Heffley asks or says, that was so interesting. You mentioned that when we meditate, the brain shuts down and allows other information in. What parts of the brain are turning on at that point? Have they been able to see that in functional MRIs?
Yeah, so I will be give the caveat that I am not, you know, a neurologist or a neurosurgeon or anything like that. My understanding is, the theory is that it really quiets some of the connectivity, and there may be someone on here who can speak to this more than me, that this has been found in imaging studies, and that the idea is that perhaps then that is allowing sort of what we might think of as what Jung called the collective unconscious, allowing to connect to some higher level of consciousness that we may all have access to if we can get to that point. If you ever talk with mediums or work with mediums, and we've done that, we've been doing some MRIs, not MRIs, but FNIRs, which is sort of a different kind of version. It gets very similar data, but looking at what are mediums doing when they're accessing information, what's happening in their brain. And the hypothesis is the same, that somehow, and they report this, they have the sense that they are sort of quieting down other things and sort of allowing access to some source of information. It's very interesting. So talk to your local medium and see what they do. It's fascinating.
That's so cool. All right. So James Allen says you have experience with both TM and Vipassana, I think is how you pronounce it. Do you see any?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you see any differences or similarities in the context of the topics that you presented?
That's a really good question. I mean, the biggest difference is that, is what's popular, which is interesting. TM sort of rose and fell, and it's hard, I'll be very candid. I mean, it's harder now to get funding for a TM study than a Vipassana meditation study. I think that's a great question that I need to explore more to see I'm assuming that question's about the content of the contemplative practice, and I would need to look at that and see, are there differences in what's happening in the brain? Are there differences in what people are reporting? And that's a good question that I don't know the answer to.
There's no new questions now. There's some wonderful comments in here. I actually had a question, if that's all right. But for when people describe being able to feel some sort of sensation, as you mentioned with the woman who's grieving for her mother, or other things that they reach out and they feel like they're communicating with these, do you think that these entities are creations of our own brain, or are they some sort of scientific thing that we don't completely understand yet? Or is it like, which realm is it more in? Just cognition or psychology? Is it something we make for ourselves, or something that is actually we're tapping into?
My first inclination is to say that it is there are probably occasions of both. That I know in working with grieving people for so long, I can't always explain it. Sometimes I think it may be a psychological manifestation of their defense mechanism that has developed this to sort of cope. And yet the impact is so much more profound than one would expect from that. So in the work I've read and seen, there are different theories, and this is where we, get more into the theory of, well, what could that be? Could that be the consciousness of that individual existing on a different plane? Some sort of idea that we exist outside of our body in some way, and then that still is here. It's still present. We just, as humans in this body with our limited sensory perceptions, we just don't always see it. But perhaps in extreme grief or contemplative practice, we can access it. So to me, that is, a reasonable explanation also of what may be happening, that in that crisis state, because remember, these people are doing something to alter their consciousness. I have now accessed something. I can see something. It's like putting on glasses. Like I couldn't see it before. And now through this practice, I've put on glasses and I can see it. It's always been there. It's just now I can interact with it because of the state of consciousness that I've achieved.
Lovely. I believe Ed actually wanted to say something. So
Wonderful. I just want to throw something in related to the question a couple of seconds ago about the research into Vipassana and TM. And this is indeed a really interesting topic and something I've been interested in for a long time. And what I'm trying to do is get the researchers of the different meditation practices to talk to each other, which unfortunately does not happen as nearly as much as it might. I do happen to know that, though, in terms of TM, it's like they're kind of closed off in their own realm. That's changing a little bit, but for one thing, the practice, there is a resurgence of practice of people actually learning the practice. But related to this talk, there's actually some extraordinary research happening in terms of Kim mentioned the term siddhis, extraordinary abilities. So there's this whole thing called the TM Siddhis program. And so you have neurobiological research happening into the higher stages and all this kind of, what people would say mystical experience. So I just think it's important to put that in it. And they are getting fun. It's funny, they are
Good,
getting
good.
from governmental sources every time. But, for the life of me, I'm trying to get it's almost like, there's a whole social political dynamics of you've got consciousness research in relationship to the academy at large, and that's what I was saying before, like DOPS, the work that Kim and her colleagues are doing. I mean, they're absolute pioneers in all that because you've got that. But then within, I would say there's two major movements. There's a contemplative studies movement, and I'm sort of involved in it. And then there's a consciousness studies movement. I noticed actually several people here from the Society of Consciousness Studies, which I'm on the advisory council. And I'm trying to get contemplative studies and conscious studies to talk to each other. I'm trying to get researchers from the different meditation lineages to talk to each other. And you would think, well, oh, they would be so, so thrilled to be talking across and it's like, no, it's not happening. But anyway, not to get too much on a tangent here, but just that actually there is extraordinary research in TM and in the other meditation modalities about this very thing. We just need to we need to open up those channels.
Thank you for that. Very helpful. I think Stephen Bain has had his hand up for a while, unless he's swatting flies. I just noticed.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, two questions. The first is, and I communicated with you about this earlier, is I had a near-death experience and an out-of-body experience almost exactly 40 years ago. And I pretty much think about it every day of my life, but I've never associated any other special abilities or other communications with it. But my question is different. It's really more from the scientific point of view. Is I've always noticed that there are tremendous number of things that we learn examining twins. Twin studies are in everything, in genetics or whatever. But it would seem to me that we know that they are very closely connected emotionally and at whatever plane you want to pick. And it would seem to me they would be a great group of people to study. Now, one quick comment, there's a town in Brazil where almost everybody in the town, I mean, like, it's unbelievable, like 30,000 people is a twin. And they're used in a lot of these studies all the time. And I'm just wondering if that might be one of your targets for research in the future.
Well, I do have colleagues in Brazil, so I that's fascinating. That's a really interesting idea. Thank you.
yeah,
I have a
lovely.
question for you. I have a question for you, Kim. I'll get back to you, Maeve, too, because I love you playing monitor. You were doing an awesome job. I've been fascinated as somebody who's been a TM practitioner for 30 years. TM very much went science, 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 science. Originally, it was the spiritual regeneration movement, and then it became transcendental meditation. And I think when, so many people in this audience are scientists, and I myself am interested in science, but I'm also interested in the heart of spirituality. And what really intrigues me about your work and the way that you talk about this is how much heart you bring into the conversation about how much you want to think about compassion and how, the science is important, but the more qualitative information is also really shifting our understanding of what consciousness is and even our connection to humanities. I mean, all great literature, basically starts with the moment of, wow, the connection to all that is. We can think of from Rumi and Know Thyself and on and on and on it goes. We recognize that we're just telling the same story over and over and over again. And so what really attracts me to your work is the humanistic element of how you talk about the science. And I'm just curious how scientists react to the humanistic approach that you have in your work.
That's an interesting question. I don't think it's quite fair to answer that because I've been at the University of Virginia my whole career, and most of the scientists I know are there. And of course, they've sort of known of Dops and Raymond Moody, and people even early on. So I feel very fortunate that I've been well received. And, I am a clinical psychologist, and in mainstream clinical psychology, and have felt very much like I'm able to sort of have a foot in each side. I think clinical psychologists can be some of the most brutal on these areas, unfortunately, which is sort of ironic. If you're a clinical psychologist, you might know what I mean, where we fought so hard to be a science, to be considered up there with the big boys like biology and math and physics, and that sometimes we're our harshest on respect to that. So that's where I find sort of the challenges, not so much from physicists or biologists, but really from my colleagues in clinical psychology outside of the university, where it's a little more challenging. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
I
there's a
saw
really,
some people nodding their heads, so thank you. It's
Yeah.
not just me, okay?
I just noticed a really interesting question in the chat. Craig Braun asks, have you ever compared the near-death experiences to the descriptions of the Bardo in the Tibetan Book of the Dead? He says, I'm no expert, but it suggests that the sense of existing beyond death may be only a stage and most of us will dissipate and fall into unconsciousness, which I thought was interesting too, because I thought the Bardo was something happened right a few months before you died and you started kind of slipping between points in your life, but I could be misinformed on that.
That is fascinating. Bruce Grayson would be the one to answer that. I've not read anything that he's written about that, but that would be really an interesting comparison for sure. So many good ideas.
Also,
Yeah.
Toby Zosner asks, will you be making the paper on the quiet brain during meditation available to us?
I certainly can. Yeah. I don't think it's in my materials right now, but yeah, I can hand that off to Molly and Ed.
Lovely. There's a few more questions here. Sandy Weiner asks, how far are you getting with research into psychedelic substances? Any firsthand research on your part? Thank you.
Oh, well, that has just begun and I'm super excited. My hope, my chair is on board with this. In the future, it would be in Virginia, it would have to be research, a research sort of implementation. And, I think just looking again at, comparisons with different psychedelics for expanding consciousness we may have to start off with looking at the implications for mood disorders, anxiety, PTSD, that sort of thing. My hope is that we then can expand it further to these other aspects.
Awesome. And we're kind of trickling low on questions right now, but Don Price asks, do you believe we create our own reality? What we perceive is what we present now? That's the wording.
You know, I would have to say, if I have to give a yes or no answer, I would have to say yes. I don't know if that's from my early readings and interpretations of Emanuel Swedenborg or or my own philosophy. I do believe there is a sense of, you know, I work a lot with people with personality disorders and teaching dialectical behavior therapy, and that is a big component of it, that we approach this life, this reality, with our own filter. And so it really, you know, we really can both look at something and see different things and both be right. And I do think that explains why maybe some people have more access to this information than others, just naturally. And then that we can also cultivate this ability in addition to having some of it already sort of preloaded.
I see Martha Travers's hand up. Martha, you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you, Kim. This is very beautiful and stimulating. I am reflecting on your question about what more people having these types of experiences might suggest about the future for humanity, and also about the idea of seeking a way to help people have these experiences when they're not happening spontaneously. And I have had experiences of being visited by people who have passed on, and out-of-body experiences and other very mystical experiences. And my feeling is that these things happen when the person is spiritually ready, and that it's not something that can be forced. And so that causes me to wonder how one would go about initiating these experiences, that the individual would need to be seeking, would need to come for the experience, and from my way of seeing, they would need to be at a soul level where it was appropriate for them to have that experience. And then in terms of the feeling about where humanity is moving, the fact that we are able to communicate like we are now, all of us who are here in this gathering, and the access to the internet, for people to be able to share their stories and realize that many people are having these experiences. They are part of human nature to be having these experiences. They're not something odd or somehow super rare. And probably all of our ancestors, the way that our indigenous ancestors lived, this is the way of perceiving and the way of experiencing that we have all come from. And it's only been recently that we've had certain kinds of training that has closed off our access to these experiences. But it does seem to me that communicating about them with others reinforces people who may feel isolated, and that in and of itself is moving us forward. And that, you know, my personal feeling is that if people understand that their journey here in this lifetime is part of a circle, that it's not linear, that the way they treat themselves and the way they treat others and the way they treat all of the beings who share this world with us will be the way of peace. And that there will, I think it's the fear of death and the unconscious belief, for some it's unconscious, that they've got it, that they only have just so much time, therefore they have to get as much as they can possibly get in whatever way they can get it, that would disappear. So thank you for letting me express that.
Beautiful. It's that is beautiful. And it's interesting though that we did a study which was more like an exposure study to your point about, you know, I agree, people often need to seek it and be ready to enter into sort of a contemplative or meditative state. One study we did, which was interesting, was with students, undergraduate students, upper level undergraduate students here at UVA, and they were taught a survey course of different meditative practices, Buddhist practices. So the course was set up where they had 1 day a week of a lecture on the traditions, where these came from. And then 1 day a week was exposure to sort of more contemporary applications. So different kinds of meditations that are used now. And then they had a lab where they meditated, and they were asked to meditate daily and record it. And we did some measures of them pre, middle, and post. Again, they're just in a class, they just signed up for a class, and they completed these measures, and we found significant changes just during that time in things that you might not expect. Compassion for self and others, so some of these things can change, I think, even with exposure. So this was not an intensive training or anything, but it was really being exposed to the information, which was, to me, very, very positive. I didn't expect to see any changes very much at all, and yet we did, and we did publish that. So I think we had 2 publications on that, and I thought that was really pretty hopeful. So thank you.
Yeah, Ali Hussein has a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Kim, for that incredible presentation, and thank you to Ed and Molly for putting this together. So Kim, I did my PhD in Islamic mysticism and Sufism. I did my research on Jesus and Sufism, but then my real work now is on the intersections of spirituality and creativity in contemporary culture. And it seems to me that an interesting sort of, one of the many interesting areas where they overlap is the idea of liminality, right? Especially in an out-of-body experience or, near-death experience, it's neither being in a completely otherworldly realm and neither being completely immersed in the material, but sort of being in this in-between state. So I wonder how, if that plays at all into your research. And then the other, it's a very open-ended question, and so you can feel free to answer it or not, but how do you think, because to me, it seems like it's a very interdisciplinary boundary to push to look at collective memory, right? Like in America, for example, over many generations, going back to the indigenous First Nation, Native American traditions of this idea of out-of-body near-death experiences. And perhaps there is some kind of transmission. The reason I say it's interdisciplinary is because we need to get, the humanities on board with this project. And from your perspective, in clinical psychology, in Dobbs, in this wonderful program, how do you foresee something like that happening, that type of research?
Well, that's really interesting. I have a colleague, Maurisa Prey, who is a psychoanalyst, and he has, he's very much smarter than me, I tell you that. He's looked at this sort of he's specifically looking at the Black population, the African Americans specifically, and looking at the transmission of trauma through the generations and the impact, and really looking at this consciousness, the components that are associated there that are passed on. Again, it's way beyond my comprehension. I think you're right, though. We would need to bring to the table, psychoanalysts who have this deep knowledge there, or Jungian analysts, or as well as anthropology and and religious studies and humanism, interdisciplinary humanists. I mean, to look at this, because I think that is a very rich area. Absolutely, absolutely, that we haven't even begun to touch.
Oh, lovely. Well, there's no more questions in chat, but if anyone wants to like unmute or anything, that would be lovely.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here because this is such a timely, this thing is getting more exciting by the moment. And Ali, it's so great to see you. We just met by email today, and this whole creativity thing, because Molly and I have been talking about, in fact, Molly's been really pushing this in a way to for creativity to be one of our next themes. And this is, this whole idea that Ali is bringing up about liminality. And I mean, there's like we could do a whole symposium, 10 symposia on every single one of these, and so for somebody like me being involved in the intersection of improvised music and meditation practice and consciousness and all this kind of thing, I mean, and then, so I thought I'd just take a moment about some of the things that Molly and I are talking about, and this would be, maybe we could even open the floor for ideas, but so we're talking, as I said, about creativity. We're talking about, Kim just mentioned something about African-American population and the intersection with all this work with what on most campuses being called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then there's like something that comes after the I, and it changes every week and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, my particular work in terms of Black music, being in jazz, I mean, it's a natural fit. Very deep, and I see my friend, speaking of Brazil, by the way, I see my friend Rui Carvalho from Brazil is actually joining us here. So Rui, it's wonderful to see you. We're going to see each other actually in Brazil in a few months. Fingers crossed on that. But I think, so one of the points here is just the infinite correlations, the infinite intersectionality, as to use an academic buzzword now. I mean, like if you're in consciousness, it's like what? That consciousness is nothing if it's not intersectionalized. So it's like somehow the academy takes a while to dig into certain things. But so, and then Martha, you asked. Good to see you too, Martha. Martha's doing wonderful work in our program in jazz and contemplative studies, by the way, which is going on. It's actually into its third decade now, and the question about and Kim of course set this up in certain when she said "so what," which happens to be the famous name of a jazz piece, and Martha kind of reiterated that question in terms of impact on where does humanity go? I mean, we have some serious things to deal with. So this theme came up just in the last couple of days too about the intersection of consciousness and eco-sustainability. So now we have creativity, we have consciousness that survives bodily death. And by the way, on the bardos, I mean that would be a whole thing in itself, which is it's very interesting, maybe because there may be before death sort of some preliminary signs of entering into that thing, but I think generally speaking, there's different levels of the bardos after death. I mean, but anyway, so there's so many different things. And one of the things I'm so excited about these talks is that no matter where we start, it's like, people coming together, the things that emerge, that's really where the action is, in the collective exchange. It's just an amazing thing. So, and just quickly, just to, link what we've heard tonight with several of the prior talks. We had Ursula Goodenow on religious naturalism, which is a very different sort of approach to consciousness, but still there's a place for that. We teamed up with the medical school, Steve Ragsdale. I think he's still with us. We had Yuria Saledwin coming from an indigenous Ecuadorian perspective a few months ago. Julia Mossbridge talking about from neuroscience. And Kim, I love the way you finessed the response to it, your reception of your scientific colleagues, because basically, there's a lot of stereotypes abound, and they're not invalid, but there's also extraordinary people who are mystical in the scientific community and are driven by the heart first. That was a great question. but anyway, Julia Mossbridge is dealing, neuroscience, but dealing with transcendence of time and space in what's called retrocausation. So how engagement with our future and our future selves can actually impact the. This is, talk about a kind of a Zen paradox. I mean, just how the future can actually impact today. I mean, it's like. So this, I mean, it's just kind of an infinite topic, and these questions are just fantastic. So I'm just, we have a little bit more time here. I'm just going to get out of the way.
Yeah, speaking of questions, Heather has another question actually.
Hey guys, I'm a Reiki master, and what I've noticed is when I'm working with my clients that many of them will have mystical experiences. And I guess just to kind of shorten it, my question is, are there any studies related to acupuncture, energy work, that sort of thing, and the effects of consciousness?
That's a really good question. I am not, that is not my area of expertise. I hope that someone on here might know.
I actually, Heather, if you remind me by email, I was speaking at a small conference last spring with a Reiki master who was talking about some research that was happening at Columbia, and I could ask her to send that to you. It was about distant healing, if I remember correctly. So I'd be happy to share it with you if you email me.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. Does anybody else have any comments or questions before we lose our lovely presenter this evening?
I'll be lost back into Zoom land, right?
Yes, we'll all be splitting apart, floating around in the cosmos. We'll have to collect each other somewhere else. Maeve, do you see any questions? Oh, Mark,
There's
you have a
couple
question,
excellent things.
please.
Oh yes, Marcus.
Well,
Mark, I
thank
love your
you.
background. I'm new.
Nah, yeah. Well, Uranus is having an interesting effect on us these days. Kim, wonderful presentation, beautiful job. And I love how all this weaving is happening here. And I'd love to put that little plug in for Julia Mossbridge and the Institute for Love and Time. And some of the research they're doing in retrocausality, as well as using unconditional love as a tool, because unconditional love is timeless by definition. I would love to explore something with anyone on this group tonight. I'm working on a project called Conscious Linguistics, which is a way to raise consciousness by asking beautiful questions that are addressed toward something closer to our true nature. Like if we were to ask our native state abilities, which are like the cities, which are covered by our conditioning, our traumas, our experiences, our all of those things are on top of our true nature. And so if we ask these beautiful questions of the city, then that is answered by that aspect of our true nature. And that helps diminish the influence of the shadows and the conditioning and the traumas. And I say beautiful questions, bringing back this kind of mentoring style instead of trying to teach this. And we have these dialogue groups around this that work on coming up with those beautiful questions. And I put a link earlier in the chat to a thing called the Gene Keys, which is a wonderful contemplative practice that does include 64 cities in a spectrum of consciousness that was received through kind of a multi-dimensional download. So I'd really love to invite anyone, and I would love to explore this further. Ed and I met at I think it was an IONS meeting over at Sandy Wiener's house. And I love Ed, thank you. And I would love to explore this further with anyone here on the call.
Looks like Sandy has his hand up there. Hey, Sandy.
Let me mute myself. So Kim, this is just terrific. And I might be a little further on talking to my wife and some of my closest friends about these subjects, but I'm afraid the eyes will still glaze over. So anyway, here's a side question. So what is it that you do in your life when you're not doing your research into these wonderful topics? What is your life like otherwise? It's just great here.
I mean, my life is awesome. I am married to my soulmate. I swear to goodness, I saw him at a med school party. I walked down into the basement and this amazing man was playing the drums with the med school band, and he was in the zone. And I said, you know, that's the man I'm going to marry. And sure enough, it ended up happening. We have a wonderful daughter who is a yoga instructor and applying to graduate school in psychology. God help her. And she and I worked together to write this book, which we just had the best time writing. She's an old soul, I'm certain. So I spend a lot of time with my family. I love bicycling. I love nature. I grew up, I think my mother was Wiccan. If she knew what that was, she would have been a Wiccan. We really grew up worshiping the earth in West Virginia and just connecting with nature. That's my happy place. And I, you know, speaking of getting to another place, another level of consciousness, I can do that in nature, as I'm sure many people can. And Mark, that makes me think of your sense of this being our true nature, and where do we find that? And I think being in nature is a way as well to achieve these states. So I spend as much time. I have to have my nature bath every day. Sun, wind, rain, snow, it doesn't matter. I need that. So I was really enjoying the full moon recently. So thanks for asking.
Thanks for your answer.
Well, thank you all. It's been an honor being able to share this time with you. And I am just really filled up with excitement, with nourishment from all of you. It's been a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, so much for your warmth and your vulnerability and your honesty and your scholarly research. It's the best combination of things to share with this group. It's been wonderful. Ed, do you want to close out with any words, or Maeve, do you have any last things as our tech guru? I sent Maeve a private chat and I said, my husband's been texting me, he's listening, and he said, I want to hire Maeve. So Maeve is also our rock star tonight. So huge kudos to you, because we had some tech issues at the beginning as old folks. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, lovely. I'm just glad it's going smoothly. There are a couple of extra questions that we didn't necessarily get to in the chat, just like for time's sake and whatnot, but there's some wonderful comments. Just I've been loving watching everyone talk about this and provide resources. This is something I'm really interested in too. So it's lovely to see people who know so much more than I do talk about this. So it's been really great.
And just to follow up, because we are at the edge here, but thanks so much, Maeve, and talk in the spirit of spontaneity. Maeve entered our orbit a whole 2 days ago, and so it's a good thing too. And we had some snags, but she was instrumental in that. So wonderful, and thanks, Molly, too. I mentioned in the chat that Molly is a major kind of force in this work as an author and a pedagogue at the College of Creative Studies. And I'm doing my own work here at Michigan. So we're sort of team. This is kind of a cross-institutional thing. We actually want to build up the network. So at the University of Michigan, the College of Creative Studies in Detroit. So we have that creativity theme too. And but thanks again so much, Kim. I mean, it's just been now you're definitely, for better or for worse. But we promise you'll be happy that we're going to keep you in our loop. And who knows, when our paths will intersect again, and give our best to it, and particularly my best to Bruce and Jim and Ed Kelly, like everyone at the division there. And
I will.
it's just tell them I'm their biggest fan, and
I will.
such an
Thank you.
honor to connect. So
Thank
thank you
you.
so much. Thanks everyone. We see new faces every time. This is I'm so excited. I've never been more excited to be part of this, and we're gonna be definitely stretching some boundaries. So let's be tuned. In a couple months, we're coming back. So yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you so much, Kim.
Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.